Hello, in this video I'm going to be covering how to create a Zelda-inspired landscape in Unreal Engine using maps exported from Gaea, procedural content generation, and world partitioning. I'm going to show you how to create a custom landscape shaped by a height map that I exported out of Gaea, which you can download in the description. I will cover how to use a PCG volume to simulate grass, flowers, trees, and rocks. And finally, how to combine that PCG volume with an incredibly large landscape using world partitions and partitioning of PCG volumes, which will allow you to simulate a lot of foliage very efficiently. We have a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Okay, so I'm going to start with this completely empty project, and the first thing I'm going to do is enable a few things in the project setting. I'll go up to the edit dropdown, come to project settings. Let's type in mesh and distance, and you want to double check that you have this generate mesh distance fields checked on. This is just very specific to the asset pack that I'm going to be showing you how to use. It's a stylized asset pack, so it needs a few project settings enabled. This one, the other one it needs enabled is runtime virtual textures. So I'll type in virtual texture and I'll come over here to enable virtual texture support and check that on. Next, I'm going to enable our procedural content generation plugin. So I'll go up to edit and plugins and type in PCG. And in this case, all I need is the procedural content generation framework right here. I'll enable that and I'll go ahead and hit restart now. Once my project has reopened, I am ready to import my asset pack. The asset pack I'm going to be using for this tutorial is called the Lush Stylized Environment Asset Pack. Thankfully, it's very inexpensive, and I really think this is one of the best stylized asset packs out there. It's very well organized. The assets are very well optimized. I think this would be a great place for you to start if you're looking at getting into stylized environments. I'm going to be using this one. Of course, the things in this tutorial you can apply to other stylized asset packs, but I'm going to be using this one and I will provide a link to it below this video. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add to project. It's going to ask me which project I want to add it to. So I'm going to scroll down to the one I just made, Zelda landscape, hit add to project. Once that's done, you will see a new folder in your content browser area and it will be called Lush Stylized Environment Set. I'm going to make a new folder by right clicking and choosing new folder, calling it levels. Next, I'm going to come up here to the project settings by coming to edit project settings, and I'm going to type in world partition. Make sure we enable streaming here. When I have that enabled, I can go ahead and come up here to file and choose new level. Now, the reason why we're doing this instead of right clicking in the content browser and making a new level that way is because in order for us to use the optimization settings that I'm going to be showing you later in the video, that's going to allow us to populate PCG over a very large landscape and still be efficient, we need to make sure we create this level using the open world setup, which will take advantage of world partitions. So that's why we're coming up here to file and new level instead. And we get this option box here and we can choose empty open world level, hit create, and we will have a blank level. So let's go ahead and make our lighting setup. I'm going to come up here to window, choose environment light mixer. We're going to do a very basic lighting setup. We'll choose this button, create skylight, create atmospheric light, create sky atmosphere, create volumetric cloud, create height fog. Once we've done that, we have our lighting set up in our level. We can go ahead and save it into our levels folder. So I'll come up here to the file drop down again and choose save current level as, and we'll call this L for level _ Zelda landscape. Go ahead and hit save, and you should see your level pop up in the levels folder, as well as these HLOD layers, which are letting us know that this level is set up for world partition correctly. So at this point, you have two options. I am going to show you the process of using some texture maps that I exported from a software called Gaea. These are black and white texture maps that will tell the landscape the shape it should be. Gaea itself is a great tool for creating these landscape-like shapes and exporting them into texture maps to be able to use in Unreal Engine. If you would like a tutorial on how to use this software to get this kind of result, definitely let me know in the comments below and I'll try to make a video on that. Otherwise, I've provided a link below in the description of this video for these specific texture maps that I exported, so you're welcome to grab those if you'd like. So I'll be using this landscape height texture for this section. If you don't want to use texture maps, that's completely fine. You can just go ahead and hit the create button here and sculpt your landscape using the tools inside of Unreal Engine. But for me, I'm going to come over to the import file section, click the three dots next to the height map file here, navigate to my texture maps, and choose landscape height here and click open. You should see your landscape automatically change its shape, which looks great. But before I hit import, I want to add the material that comes with the asset pack that we downloaded onto the landscape. I will choose the Lush Environments folder here. I'm actually going to change my thumbnail size for these folders because I find them a little bit large. So I'll change them to small for me. But we want to come to the landscape folder inside of the Lush Environments pack. We want this MILND01. I'm going to drag that on to the material section in the landscape box here, and then go ahead and hit import. At first, it's going to look just white everywhere, and that is because this landscape material comes with landscape layers already built into it. But those landscape layers haven't been told what data to use in order to place themselves. I can come over to the Paint tab in the landscape settings. I'm going to come over here to the grass section at the top and go ahead and hit the plus button here and choose weight blended layer. It's going to ask you where to save these maps. I just usually use whatever the default place is, and you can see the grass map is going to be called grass layer info. Hit save, and it's going to automatically populate your landscape with the material, which is really cool. Now, my landscape is a bit too large in height, so we can always adjust the settings of the depth or height of our landscape by coming back to the selection mode here, clicking on our landscape, the scale here under the Z value, I'm going to drop down to 50. So this is actually really great auto material that comes with this pack. But for me, I actually don't want to use the foliage spawning that comes with this asset pack. I want to create a new foliage spawning setup with PCG, so I have a little bit more control over the foliage itself. I can add more trees and other kinds of foliage to automatically populate the entire landscape, not just grass. I will need to modify the landscape material in order to have it stop spawning this grass so I can start spawning my grass. So I'll come back over to the content, come to the Lush Environment set here, come to the landscape folder again, and I'm going to go ahead and take this landscape and duplicate it. Since this material instance already has a beautiful setup in terms of settings, we're going to duplicate that one as well. In this master material, I'll call it base_PCG. And I'll double click the material instance here and scroll down to the place in the material where it references its master material, and I will just drag my PCG master material into the parent field here. Once that's done, I can open that master material and start making some adjustments, and it will be reflected in the instance. If we look at this material here, it's wonderfully organized, and this section here is where it is telling the landscape to start spawning the actual grass foliage. And again, you can keep this and use the grass foliage if you want, but I'm going to go ahead and delete this for this master material. And remember, we have the original one, so if you want to go back, you always have that option. We go ahead and hit save. We come back to our landscape here, select it, and scroll down to our material. We just need to replace our material instance, the second one, with the one we put in before. And now it still maintains all the material logic, but is no longer spawning grass. So at this point, let's come back to our content folder here and right click and make a new folder. And this we will call PCG. I will double click on that to open it, right click in the empty space, come over to PCG graph. Let's call this PCG_Zelda. Let's drag that into our environment, double click on it to open it. Let's open up the input section here, drag off of our landscape, and make a new surface sampler by typing in surface and choosing surface sampler. And for me, I'm going to go ahead and choose unbounded. Now you have to be careful with this setting because what it's saying is it's no longer using the bounds of the PCG volume in order to choose where to spawn points and foliage. If you have a really large landscape like this, you just want to make sure that you're not overdoing it or spawning things somewhere where you don't actually need to spawn it. So for the sake of efficiency, for the moment, I'm going to reduce the points per square meter here to 0.05 before I start debugging it, just in case it's too many points for the computer to handle, it crashes. Let's contract that window, come to our PCG volume in the world and scroll up to where it says generate here. Go ahead and hit generate so that it starts working in our environment. Then I'll come back to my graph here, hit D to debug with the surface sampler selected. Now we can see all the points that it is spawning on our landscape here. However, right now it's spawning everywhere. And what we would like to do is filter out the points so it's only getting the points that are on the grassy areas of your landscape. We can actually sample the landscape layers, which you'll remember are over here, our landscape section here. Under paint, we have all of our material layers that came with the master material from our asset pack, and if you've set these up yourself as well, they should show up here if you have a custom material. But we can actually get the data of what points are overlapping with those materials into our PCG graph. So let's see how to do that. I'm going to stop debugging this. I'm going to drag off here and type in filter. And what I want is point filter. In the past, I've typed in points plural filter. That's not what we want. We want singular point filter. By default, the point filter is grabbing density as the target attribute. And what we want is to put in the exact name of the layer that we want to sample here. For me, that would be grass. And if you're ever not sure what layers you have contained within your landscape, what you can do is you can click on this node here, or any node for that matter, come up to this little drop down and choose the name of this graph that you are looking at. Then right click on that node and choose inspect, or hit the A key. Then if we look at this little pane down here at the bottom of our PCG tool, we can see all the types of data we're getting from this node. And in this case, it's coming from the surface sampler here. If we go all the way to the right, we can start to see which layers are which. And right now it's showing me that I only have a grass layer. So this is a good point actually to go back to our landscape layer and make sure we have layer data for each type of material that we have on it. Come back to my drop down, choose landscape, come back to the paint section here under cliff, which is other material that I have. I'm going to hit the plus button and create a weight blended layer, same as the grass. Hit save, and I'll do one for riverbed because I might want to add that in as well later, as well as grass only, mud, gravel. I'm not actually using sand in this example, so I'll leave that blank. So now that we have our texture data set up as inputs, I can use the rest of those maps that I exported out of Gaea. So coming over here to the Manage tab in the landscape settings, I can come and choose Import. You'll notice this is the same area where we were importing the height map for the landscape. Now we can actually import texture maps in order to place grass and other materials. I can come to this layer section, expand it, and this will show all the landscape layers that are currently set up. Thankfully, this landscape material that comes with this project has these set up for you. So it's a very simple matter of just swapping the inputs that they're using for textures that you're importing. So it'll be a pretty easy process for us. So I'm just going to come over here to the grass input, enable it, and I'll use the 3-dot button here to load my texture. And I'm going to be choosing the grass layer texture. I'm going to go ahead and hit open. You won't see anything happen right away because we need to import it. But before I do that, I will check on cliff, choose the cliff layer, and I'm actually going to go and check on riverbed here and choose my rivers layer option. The rest of these I'll leave as layers that I can paint on afterwards. So when I have all of my textures set up and ready to go, I'll go ahead and hit the import button. If you run into this error here, for some reason, it's forgetting that the landscape height map that I imported in the first section is actually this exact size that it's asking for. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel and come over here to the height map file here and reload my height map from the textures. Go ahead and hit import and everything should work after that. So if I switch back to my selection mode here, we can see that the landscape layers have themselves been loaded in correctly again. In this case, we've just switched over from using the native height blending masks that the master material was using before to using these specific texture masks that I've exported from Gaea, or if you're using World Machine, it's the same process. So now if we open our PCG graph here again, we can scroll to the right and we will see different values in here for grass and cliff. Go down further, we'll also see values in the riverbed section. That's good. That means we're getting specific data about where those points are living on the surface. So let's also fix this warning sign on the points filter node. I'm going to go ahead and select it and come over to the right side here where it says the type of the data that we're getting from the point filter. And you can see down here that the layers are giving us float values, so single number values. So I need to change this type to a float. So I can come and check on the use constant threshold checkbox here, and then I can switch my type of data down to a float here, and that should get rid of your error. If we come over to this node that was point filtering out our grass attribute, I drag off of the inside filter section, and I'll just add a transform node, type in transform, choose transform points, and we hit debug on that node by pressing D. We can see our points starting to get masked out of the areas where there is a cliff material. And if they're still kind of seeping into those areas where there's cliffs, we can always just come back to our nodes here, choose the point filter node. Here under the float value is where we can start to cut into that mask a little bit more. So if I increase it up, it'll be cutting into values that are in the area where it's not exactly a one material or the other, it's a blend. And so you have a lot of values in between for points that are like deciding which material they're actually on. And so by cutting into this float value here and raising it, we're cutting out some of those points in between. And so now you can see we have points that are pretty clearly just on the grass areas, which is great. So let's use this to spawn some grass. So I will stop inspecting this node and stop debugging this node, and we'll go ahead and drag off of here and create a static mesh spawner. And this will be what we use to put in our grass. So I'll come over here to the mesh entries section, hit the plus button and expand the index 0 and the descriptor, and right here where it says static mesh, I'll just hit the drop down and type in grass. And there's two different grass options that come with this asset pack. I'm going to choose the SM grass tiny right here. And if we come over here to our environment, we can see the grass is starting to grow in the grassy areas. And I'm actually going to increase the size of the grass, especially so it can cover more area. I'll come back to that transform points node that we made, increase the scale min to 2 and the scale max to 3. This might take a little moment to update because it is actually covering the entire landscape at this point. If I want to work a little faster in this case, I could come over to the surface sampler here, click on it, uncheck unbounded as we're working on the graph here. This will allow us to spawn it really quickly in a small area, and then when we're ready to, we can expand it back out to the large area. So we have our grass here looking pretty nicely. I might actually now go back to my surface sampler, increase the points per square meter to something like 0.1 again, and lower my points extent, because remember, this is making the actual points that are being spawned on the surface large, and so they bump into each other, not allowing for us to spawn as many points. So if I come over here to the points extent and I lower them to something like 10, for example, you can see we're getting a lot more grass. Depending on the size of your landscape, this might still not even seem like enough points, in which case you could increase the points per square meter here up to 0.5. Now we're getting a very full area of grass. So now that we have our grass looking nice, let us add some rocks into the equation. Now I'm going to disconnect the static mesh spawner by holding down Alt and disconnecting it, just so we can actually see the points we're working with for the rocks. I'll drag off of the surface sampler here, create a density filter, hit D to debug this. We can see it's quite a lot of points. That's too many points actually for how many rocks I would like. So I'm going to keep the lower bound at 0.5, but lower the upper bound down to 0.6. Next, we'll drag off of the density filter and create a transform points. For this, I will add a random rotation in the rotation max area in the Z axes up to 360. The scale min and max, I will adjust from 0.5 in the min up to 1.5 in scale. Now we can drag off of the transform points here, add a static mesh spawner for the rocks. I will add a mesh entry again, expand the index and the descriptor, and here we will just type in stone, which is the name of the smaller rocks that come with the pack. I'll just choose this first one for now, and I can actually go to the mesh entries, contract the index 0, and add another one to give some more options. Input, I'll type in stone again, and this time I'll choose this little clump here. I think this will give some good variation. Now looking at this environment, it's still actually too many rocks for me, so I'm going to come back to the density filter, lower this upper bound down to 0.55. And that looks much better. Okay, let's actually comment these nodes so that we remember what they do. I'm going to drag over this first section here, type C on the keyboard, call it grass. We'll move it up here a little bit. And then here on the rocks, I'll type C again and call it rocks and move it up here. Now let's spawn some trees. We're going to be using almost the same exact situation as the rocks. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate those nodes. Drag over them, Control C and Control V, put it down here. I'll connect it to the surface sampler. Now for the density filter here, I actually want to create a different range just for the trees. I will choose 0.3 to 0.302 in the upper bound. So next in my transform points, I'm actually going to leave it as is and see how the trees end up looking. But for the static mesh spawner, we actually need to add the tree meshes. So I'll expand the index 0, click on the static mesh entry and type in tree and grab one of these large trees. Grab a tree for the second input as well. This one I'll choose medium 02. And remember, you can add as many versions of trees or rocks or grass that you want to keep adding more variation. So looking at these trees here, they look great. I am noticing that they are rotating slightly with the hills. For the trees specifically, I just want them to grow straight up and down. So that's very easily achieved by coming back to the transform points here and checking on the absolute rotation here. This is going to snap all the trees to the up and down rotation, allowing them to only point up. We do run into a few issues if we do this because we don't actually know sometimes that the ground is at an angle, so it might kind of come up above the surface. So we can easily fix that by coming here to the offset min and max in the Z area and just lowering it down like to -20 in min and -20 in max. That seems to fix the problem in most of the areas. So let's go ahead and drag over these nodes and press C and call that trees. Next, let's add some bushes. I'm going to take the same tree blueprint that I have here, copy it, paste it below the trees here. I'm going to give a little bit of space for something we're about to do. In the density filter, we're going to choose a completely different range. So I'm going to choose 0.7 as the lower bound, and the upper bound I will choose 0.75. In the static mesh spawner, we'll come down here to the tree input, same as before, and choose a bush. Anyone will do in both descriptors. I'll go ahead and rename the comment box here to bushes. And looking here at my environment, the bushes are way too big for me. So I'm going to come back to the transform points that I have for the bushes, switch off the offset that I have on them as well, lower the scale min and max to something like 0.2 going up to 0.5. And I feel like there's still too much of them, so I'll come back here to the density filter and choose something like 0.702, same as the trees. That'll just create a few little bushes here and there. Maybe 0.05 would be best. So now things are going to get interesting. So I want to create some plants, and I want those plants to grow specifically under the tree. I want them only to appear when there's a tree placed in my environment and grow around the base of that tree. In order to do that, we're going to need to create a distance node. And I'm going to right click in the empty space here, type in distance and create that. For the target, we're going to plug it into the tree here. Move this bushes nodes down a little bit. And then we need to get some points that we're going to use to spawn around the tree. So we'll grab a new density filter, plug it into our surface sampler up here, and plug that density filter into the source. So if we go ahead and hit D to debug and we come over to a tree, we can see some slight color variations starting to happen in the points that are directly around the tree. I'm actually going to let a little bit more points into the plant area. So I'm going to come to the density filter and lower the lower bound down so we see a lot more points. Come to the distance section here, turn on set density because I want the actual distance from the tree to affect the density color on the points. So now that that's checked on, we see black everywhere. When we start to lower the maximum distance here, we start to see discoloration only around the tree. Now that we have this data, we can come drag off of the distance node here, create another density filter, debug that one. It's cutting out all the points that are on the darker end of the spectrum, but we'll just flip that. So I'm going to drag off of the density filter and type in blueprint. And we want to create an execute blueprint node. And this will allow us to have access to a particular function that is not actually currently a node. Maybe in the future it will be, future versions of Unreal Engine, but currently we can only access it through the execute blueprint function. So I'm going to click on that node, come over here, the blueprint element type, and expand that and type in scale and choose scale by density. And we'll look at what that node is doing by debugging it. By default, you won't see anything. And that is because the scale min and max here need to be set. By default, they're both 0. So if I add a 1 into the scale max, it's a little hard to see, but the points that are closer to the tree are smaller and the ones that are farther away are bigger. We want to actually flip that. Come to the scale min and make it 1. The scale max, I'm going to make it 0. And now that is happening in reverse. Now, if we want more of a gradient, we want more of this scale to show up. So I come over to the distance node and lower it to something like 500. Come back to the density filter and make sure it is letting in as many points as possible. Maybe I'll change it to 0.6 to make sure I'm getting enough points around it. You can see they're starting to scale down as they get farther away from the tree. So now if I go ahead and plug that into another transform points node, add some random rotation by adding a 360 in the maximum in the Z value for rotation max, and under the scale we'll actually add a random scale as well from 1 to 2, and we drag off of that transform points, make a static mesh spawner. We can go ahead, expand the mesh entries section here under index, descriptor, and add a taro plant. And I actually think I added too much scale in the transform points, so I'm going to come back here and make the maximum 1 and the minimum maybe like 0.5. So now we can see we have a little clump of plants directly around the tree, which looks great. And then they get smaller as the plants grow farther from the tree, which I think gives a really natural result. You can go crazy with this as a concept to create all kinds of different natural phenomena, because it's really just about masking where seeds land, where plants are in relationship to each other. It's a very powerful approach that's pretty simple to set up. Okay, so lastly, this wouldn't be a Zelda landscape without some flowers. In this case, we're going to be using some interesting noise patterns in order to create a nice flower look. So I'm going to drag off of my surface sampler here and create a spatial noise. Let's go ahead and hit D to look at what that node is giving us. We don't see anything right away, but I'm going to come over to the contrast section and up it to 10. And then I'm going to expand the transform here and increase the scale up to 100. This is a little bit of trial and error because sometimes you don't know how big the noise is in relationship to the environment that you're working with. So you can see it gives us a noise pattern, and that noise pattern is a little less random. It's still random, but it will respect clumping a little bit better. I find that this particular setup of noise is nicer for creating clumps of foliage because you don't necessarily want them to be randomly spread. You want some kind of clumping where, you know, there's a group of flowers that are growing together, and so this helps you achieve that a little bit better. You can always play with the scale and contrast here to get a different noise look. We'll stick with this for now, and I'll drag off of the spatial noise and create a density filter, and we'll go ahead and look at that node. And for this one, I actually want to cut out quite a few of the points because I don't want too many flowers. This can always come down to your preference, but I want to increase this up a bit so there's fewer flowers. So now I have a nice clumping randomly spread over the whole area. So now I want to create even more zones for these flowers, so I'll create a larger noise. So I'm going to duplicate this spatial noise that I made, modify it, and the size of this noise, instead of being 100, I will lower it down to 5. Let's take a look at this, what this is giving us, and you can see it's creating some more targeted areas with the noise for our flowers to be spawned. I'm going to come and make another density filter out even more points. Now you can see we have some flower clumping in some very specific areas, and especially as we expand this over the whole landscape, it's going to work a lot better for us. I'm going to make one change to these points before I start spawning the actual flowers themselves, and that is I don't actually want the flowers to spawn around trees. Since the trees cast shadow, more likely than not in a natural landscape, the flowers actually won't have enough light to grow if they're growing underneath the tree. So we want to, as much as we can, capture that sort of natural phenomenon. So I'm going to reuse the same situation we used with the distance node here. I'm going to copy it and paste it over here, and we'll connect the target up to the trees as well and the source up to the points for the flowers. Drag off of it and add a density filter. Take a look at that. and we'll use it to cut out points that are directly around the tree. So that looks pretty good. Finally, let's drag off, make a static mesh spawner here, stop debugging the density filter, and here we can just expand it in the descriptor and type in flowers. And there's quite a lot of flowers that come with this pack. I'm going to stick with just 3 of them, so I'll go ahead and make another one, choose a different color, and a third one, and choose a different color. And there we now have our flowers spawning correctly. And we can always continue to play with our noise specifically to give us denser flower clumps. For example, I could come back to my flower sequence of nodes here, which I'll actually go ahead and comment, pressing C, calling it flowers. So we'll come over to our flowers nodes here, and we remember our first spatial noise is really where we cut out the kind of density of the points. Come over to here to the density filter and expand it a little bit, and that will give me some more flower clumping. And so we can just keep adjusting it till we get the look that we like. Let's go ahead and add in our grass as the final step of the puzzle here. So I'll come back up to my grass and reconnect it to the static mesh spawner. Now in my grass here, my flowers are kind of getting swallowed up, so I need to increase their size a little bit. So I'll come back down to the flowers themselves. I will disconnect them and add a transform points in between, connect it up again, and this time I'll just increase their size. So the minimum will make them as 2 and the maximum as 3 in the scale max. You can see our flowers are coming through the grass a lot better. I might even come back to the grass again in the transform points and lower it down 2 as the maximum size and maybe 1.7 as the minimum. So now that our foliage successfully spread across the landscape, if this is running smoothly enough for you, then you can come back to your surface sampler and increase this to 0.5. So let's take a look at how this is working in our environment with our landscape layers. Take a look here at my PCG volume. It's working really well in the grassy area, but when I move it over the cliff area, we can see that we're getting some bushes, flowers that are spawning on the rocks, which is not what I want. The grass is getting cut off correctly, but not the other foliage. So I'm going to open up my graph again, and we can see that we're using our point filter only for the grass. I'm actually going to move this over here and drag the point filter down, and let's decide which of these different types of foliage we want to be cut out by the rocks. I have the small rocks here. I'm actually going to leave that the way it is because I think rocks spawning on other rocks is actually going to give it a nice look. But for the flowers specifically, I'm going to disconnect it by holding Alt and pressing on the pin here and dragging it into the end of the point filter here that we're using to filter out the landscape layers. I'll come back down to the trees here and do the same thing, and the plants and the bushes. So now when we look at the rocks here, it is getting cut out correctly by the cliff materials. Now, I do want to mention really quick that if you reopen your level and you're finding that the landscape layers are no longer cutting out PCG correctly, that is because the landscape layers themselves have lost their connection to the texture. This can sometimes happen, and I ran into it specifically when building this environment. The fix for that is to take your texture files and put them somewhere in the content folder of your Unreal Engine project. So I've actually gone into my content folder here under levels, and under this folder for the landscape assets themselves, if you right click on it and choose show in Explorer, it's going to open up the actual folders on your computer. And if you drag in the actual texture files that you downloaded and are using for both the height and the grass and the cliff and other landscape layers, and you come back here to the landscape section under manage, under import, and you come to the landscape layer, grass, cliff, and riverbed, for example, and we load in those textures that are specifically within the content folder structure, it will not disconnect from them every time we close the level or close the project and reopen it. Okay, so now we have our landscape set up, we have our foliage set up, we are ready to start the process of populating our entire landscape with our PCG foliage in an efficient manner. And you'll remember at the beginning of this tutorial, we set up the world partition open world landscape setup when we first made our level, and now that's when it comes in again because we're going to be taking our PCG volume, expanding it to the entire world, and then using the partition system to let Unreal Engine slice it up into individual little smaller volumes so that it's able to parse the data individually in sections. And this is just a lot more efficient if you are familiar with the Electric Dreams project. This is why their PCG graphs foliage, even though it's so dense and it's over such a large landscape area, is able to run so smoothly, is because they're using a partitioning system. So this is how we set it up. So coming back into my level here, we can see under our landscape, if we expand it, we can see all of our different landscape partition squares basically. And so what we're going to be doing is setting up PCG to have its own version of that. The first thing I want to do is actually stop the volume from simulating, because I don't want it to actually be resimulating as it's also setting itself up over such a large area. So I am going to go ahead and take the volume here to where it says generate cleanup as buttons, and I'm going to choose cleanup. This will knock out all the points that it's simulating inside of the volume. Now I can go ahead and scale the volume up. So if you're not sure about how big your PCG volume should be, a good rule of thumb is to go and look at your landscape. Double check this number where it says overall resolution. For me, it says 2017. And so I'm going to just take that number and half it, which gives me 1008.5. And so I can come over here to the PCG volume and in the X, make it 1008.5, and in the Y as well, 1008.5. Other thing I want to do is zero its position, so it's scaling out from the center of the landscape. Hit this little button to center it. We zoom out here, we can see it is actually the exact size of our landscape. We just need to make it a little bit higher and lower in depth. I'll come back over to the scale, and in the Z axis I will make it 200, and I think that will be enough to cover the entire landscape here. So now that we have that set up, we are ready to the volume, scroll down and choose is partition. Once we choose that box and we come back up here, we can hit generate. For me personally, I actually like to go into the graph and lower the number of points before I do this, just because it will take a little bit of time to slice up the volume and re-simulate it across the whole landscape. And this will be just a little bit quicker if there's fewer points, and you can gradually increase it later. I come here to the surface sampler, click on it, and right now we're at 0.5, which is a lot of points. So even if you just drop it down to like 0.1, for example, this will let us simulate the landscape a little bit quicker. So I'll hit save. Now I'll come over here and hit generate. You'll see a little progress bar on the bottom right here, and you'll notice it's quite a bit quicker than if we were simulating points over the whole landscape. You might have to give it a minute or a few minutes depending on your computer to finish loading, but once it's done loading, you'll see your level is running very smoothly, which is awesome. It's simulating over the entire landscape. If we want to double check that we are partitioning our PCG volume correctly, we can just come over here to the world actor for the PCG, which is the instanced version of the PCG volume, and check all of these partition actors underneath. And if we zoom out, we can see each of these little cubes as I click on them. These are individual PCG volumes that are simulating separately. So now that we have this simulating correctly, let's jump back to our PCG volume and open it up, and we'll come back to our surface sampler. And now if we go ahead and increase the points to something like 0.4, give it a minute to load and repopulate through all of the volumes, and give it a few minutes to fully load. Sometimes the bar will finish, but it'll still be jerkily moving and not quite loaded all the way, kind of looking noisy, but just, sit it out, leave a few moments, and it should update all the way through all the different volumes depending on how big your landscape is. And then we have a much more efficient loaded landscape here, which is great. There you have it. If you found this video helpful, shoot me a thumbs up or a comment to let me know to make more videos like this. If you have any questions, definitely drop them in the comments. As you're working through this information, something's not working for you or I missed something, I'll do my best to answer those questions in the comments below. If you've been really digging PCG and you want to learn more from me about that, I have a lot of other videos on the channel. There's probably 2 right here. Recommend you subscribe to the channel, check out some awesome videos. All right, I will see you on the next one.